Okay, today's conversation is going to be about strategic workforce planning, and to share more details about what's happening in this space, I am talking to Ben Murphy-Ryan from ARM. Ben, thanks for your time today. Would love to hear more about your role at ARM and what you've been doing with the Imagine Collaborative.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Julie, and thank you for allowing me to come and talk about SWP. It's a hot topic in most organisations, so one we always like to talk about. So I'm Ben Murphy-Ryan. I lead the global talent acquisition team at ARM. I've been at ARM for a little over 3 years now, although it's my second time in the business, so I've actually kind of worked on and off for ARM over about 5 years. My role is to support the overall recruitment process and team for us. We're a global technology company with headquarters in the UK in Cambridge, but we are global from the West Coast in the US right across to Tokyo on the other end. So truly global business, growing at pace and scale as well. So a lot of focus in my role is looking at the kind of strategy and direction for recruiting into a growth organization. And as part of that, a big part of this conversation has been around workforce planning and how we can really think more about this in the organization. And it's not a skill set we've deployed very successfully in the past, so it's also a hot topic, and I'm currently tasked with looking after workforce planning initiatives within the organization.
Fantastic. And to help you with that, you joined the Imagine Collaborative. Are you able to share with us what is that collaborative and why you decided to join?
Yeah, so I've been kind of taking part in some of the sessions with Imagine now for about 18 months, 2 years. So ARM was involved as one of the kind of core organizations at the start of that program of work with Imagine. So Imagine is basically a collaborative forum where companies from all different sectors, sizes, scales have got together to around some interesting topics, really themed around the future of work, the future of kind of the way organizations scale and grow. And that obviously had a real resonance, as I said, to the journey here at ARM. So we've been part of a couple of different work streams. One of the work streams ended up settling onto strategic workforce planning, and that's where I've become more heavily involved as part of the kind of core project team. But equally, I've got colleagues from the learning development organisation who have been part of other work streams looking at the future of work. And we've also, there's a leadership collaboration forum there as well. And a couple of our business leaders have also taken part in some kind of peer-to-peer sessions around the same topics, but coming more from a stakeholder perspective rather than necessarily from a HR or a kind of from a procurement practitioner perspective, which is where most of the kind of work that I've been part of has really centered so far.
So tell us a bit more around the SWP Workstream and some of the activities that you've been working on, and what's been the focus for the SWP Workstream team.
Yeah, sure. And I think the great thing about Imagine is that the work is quite iterative, but also has a bit of a life of its own. So actually this started out coming out from a discussion around the kind of future workplace and the different categories of worker and where you may deploy talent in your organization in the future. And that's beyond looking at just a couple of categories. So you say, oh, we've got permanent, we've got contingent. And actually, if you look at it, I think there were 10 different buckets of type of worker that could be in an organization. And that could range from somebody who's salaried all the way through to somebody doing kind of freelancing or piecemeal work in the kind of gig economy. And out of that came a discussion around how are organizations going to plan with all this going on, right? How do you plan to get the right talent into your organization? How do you know what skills you need more of or less of in your organizations? And that really led into there's a topic to deep dive on, which was about workforce planning, or SWP as we've kind of called it in the context of here. And it's really around how can we develop a muscle more to be able to help our organizations plan better over both a short term but a longer term time frame. And that's really where the work on SWP has come from in the past 18 months or so. And that's led to a series of workshops which we've done, which have all been collaborative, so people getting together, sharing, this is what I've seen in my organization, this is what I see as our problems, or coming and saying, hey, we're not solved this issue, what can we do? So we've done a number of workshops and collaborative sessions where we've actually kind of explored these topics together. We've experimented, we've looked at some theory and some practice, and that really kind of developed into a stream of work, which we're calling the positioning for SWP, which is really what we've been doing over the past 18 months or so.
And that work led to running an experiment to try new things with SWP. Tell us about the experiment you're running at ARM.
Yeah, so one of the kind of great things about the program of work has been about actually hearing about people saying, well, this is what I've done in my organization, or actually saying, that's a really great idea, I'd like to take that back in and try to apply that in the context of where we are now, what we need to do at the moment. For me at ARM, we had a workshop session I think towards the back end of last year, where we were discussing kind of how to position the workforce planning within organizations. And around it's really hard, right? Because everyone talks about this, but in most organizations, there's so much going on, the focus on business planning, on finance planning, on the cost base of the organization. And what we kind of light bulb moment realized was there was a bit of a disconnect between actually the pivotal element of people planning during our planning processes. It's just not really there, and it's almost overlooked. And again, that was the experience in our organisation, saying that people planning kind of came after business planning and finance planning have been done. And we discussed in one of the workshops about actually there's an opportunity to kind of weave the story for workforce planning back into a discussion around how that fits with the overall strategy organisation. And that was a great idea, and people were like, well, we've not necessarily had the chance to do that. And so I kind of answered, actually, I'm doing this right now. I've been asked to do a piece of work for our executive committee, so the kind of ARM managing board, around our future growth strategy. And it was actually a really interesting piece of work to say, from a talent perspective, what would the organisation look like in a few years' time, and how would we get there? What's different today, and what are the things we're going to have to start deciding to do now differently to get where we might want to get to? So it was actually a really interesting piece of work around scenario planning, which is one of the fundamental elements of workforce planning. And that was kind of the aha moment in the room, saying, how can we, can anybody experiment with it? And so I said, yes, I think I can take this back and see how we positioned this to the organisation. So that was the kind of where the experiment came from. In terms of what that looked like, I guess kind of moving that on, was around really trying to make the case for including SWP into this wider business planning activity. And one of the key tenets of the conversation, which is in the playbook that I think we'll talk about later on, is around making it clear that actually workforce planning isn't something you do in isolation. It has to be done as an integrated part of business planning. So effectively, you've got your business objectives and where you're heading towards, you've got your financial considerations, your cost base, your cost envelope to work with, and that was kind of the way we looked at it. But ultimately, you need to also align at the same time the people considerations. So what skills do you need, what capabilities, in what volume, in what places, for example, typical workforce planning kind of cycle, to be successful. And actually, it was a discussion in my organisation saying that's not how we plan at the moment. We do it in a very linear fashion. And what happens at the end of every annual cycle or of planning, we then have to kind of scrabble to try and overlay people. So what does this mean for our people? Whereas the better way of doing it is saying, actually, if we could do this on a longer term horizon, if we can do this integrated, we can actually start to think about that future, and we can iterate along the way. So it doesn't become one fixed path. It gives us lots of different options to say, this is maybe when you start thinking about in 5 years' time, we need to pivot towards this. So let's start that now.
And where are you up to in this experiment? Like, how long is the experiment going for, and what are the current outputs that you've got?
So this was interesting. So it was a positioning piece, actually. What it's led to was more work on workforce planning. So actually, the whole point of this was actually to kind of make the case for us thinking differently about workforce planning in the organisation. So actually, from that point of view, that element of the experiment has finished, and now the real work has begun to say, okay, you get what you wish for. We think there's definitely some opportunity to weave more workforce planning considerations into our planning cycle. How do we do it? And actually go off and work that out. So what that's now moved on and morphed into is a workforce planning project within the organisation. I'm actually working with one of the co-partners in the immersion program, actually, who's working with us internally at ARM on this as well, to say, okay, how do we start to operationalise this? How do we bring together people from across the organisation at ARM? So actually, we've got a steering group, we've got people together from finance, business planning, from operations, who kind of do the kind of the planning and resource planning within groups for our product. We've got a change colleague of mine from the people organisation now starting to drive a conversation about workforce planning in the organisation, with the aim that we'll actually take some of the learnings from the playbook and also be able to kind of give an iteration to our next planning cycle. We've got a cycle coming up in 3 or 4 months. So we're saying, what can we do between now and then to actually bring more people considerations through into that piece of work? So it's kind of in some ways the experiment is ongoing, but it's because it's morphed into actually a more traditional workforce planning project, albeit with this grounding in actually, let's not try and do something standalone. Let's make it a really integrated part of our planning cycle.
And if people wanted to do the same thing, run an experiment to really push SWP to be far more holistic and effective within an organisation, what are sort of 1, 2, 3 things that you would tell them about getting their peers from other functions on board? What were sort of the key learnings you've had from the journey so far?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. Actually, we're now working on the next phase of workforce planning within the Imagine Collaborative, and actually part of it is around that positioning piece and how we really align with stakeholders. So looking at SWP 2.0 and what that could look like. Part of the conversation was just around people not getting it, or people are thinking it's actually really, really difficult. And let's be honest, it is difficult. But it's difficult because it has so much interaction together, and because people try and do it in isolation as a standalone task, rather than saying it's not actually that difficult. If you say at the same time you're discussing what's our product roadmap, what do we need to do, what are the key things we need to do, if we just add and overlay skills in there, actually you can do it as you go along. So really that positioning has been part of the conversation. So I think thinking around what are the drivers in your organization and how SWP can support that is probably key. My experiment arm was actually around positioning that to some of our senior leadership to get buy-in to then invest in a further piece of work. So from that point of view, it was successful because it got that buy-in. I think the other piece as well is to just talk to people about it, because what we've discovered as we've gone through is actually people in our operations team, in our finance team, have been grappling with the same problem for a while. And so rather than trying to solve in isolation, let's get together, let's do it. And so actually we set up a steering group who are driving the conversation, but we've had a couple of really interesting chats with colleagues outside of that group where you can see a light bulb going off saying, actually I can now see if we can do this and this differently this time, it might give us an opportunity to plan differently. And actually the most recent example of this was around, there was already some work going on in a different part of the planning organization that when we looked at it, we're like, actually if we just literally put in a conversation about the skills you need to do that, we'll actually be partway there on our journey for SWP. So it's just spotting kind of the opportunity to say, this is not about new stuff. This is about adding a new consideration and a new kind of mindset into your thinking about existing planning that you're doing. So again, making it less big and scary and more iterative is probably the advice I'd give.
So it's really joining the dots with all the other functions to make sure that you're all focused on the business objective. And I guess with the skills shortage being a constant topic of conversation, is that something that SWP is also helping overcome the sort of common themes of headcount, just constant headcount discussions, and skills shortage? It actually provides more of a solution to address those and more.
Yeah, and I think that the other part of SWP we've been discussing quite a lot in the Imagine Collaborative and just in terms of best practices around thinking around those alternative futures, right, and scenarios. And actually part of that comes down to thinking around what are the skills and capabilities we need more or less of in the organisation. Or what may they be, right? We don't have to be completely accurate and get that right from day one, because jumping 2 or 3 years ahead is really tough. Going 5 or 10 years ahead is really, really tough. But actually you could say, well, actually there's 4 or 5 things that we may want to do more or less of. So let's just start tracking them now. Let's say, okay, we think we're a few years out from having to decide whether we need A or B. So why don't we see if we can invest in both, or see actually what capabilities we have in the organization for B that we didn't know, and move it around. So it just opens more options to people, and it doesn't have to be around we're going to go and make a massive change. It can be just around applying a kind of organizational scan that helps you with this lens to say, actually, we've got a view of possible scenarios or futures we're heading towards. Let's see what would be the best way of supporting that future. And ultimately, it's around kind of planting seeds now for that as well. So that's kind of been an interesting concept I've been playing around with a bit in the organisation around kind of those kind of timelines and futures and saying it's the same as business planning. And this is the bit for me that's really powerful. If you were talking around a new sales or product strategy, you'd be planting seeds now for future. We're going to put some bets down. We don't know which of these 3 or 4 bets is going to pay off, but we think in 3 or 4 years' time, one of these will. The same applies to workforce planning considerations, right? Actually, thinking about the skills and capabilities we need for the future, we don't have to be 100% accurate, but we can start to say, we feel like we might need more of this, this, and this. So why don't we start thinking about, well, how could we shift our organization that way? What does that look like now? And again, over time, as you get closer to those scenarios being reality, you can start to adjust your organization towards it. The problem is if you don't do that early enough, you're faced with these massive organizational shifts and big bang changes, which we know are really hard and quite disruptive to organizations. So for me, that's the kind of mantra I keep talking about when I talk about SWP with our leadership is around, it's about forward planning, but it's around not having to be perfect. We've been discussing recently with a group, it can be messy, right? But actually a messy view of workforce planning will still help us and give us more accuracy in the future. So it's all around kind of embracing that messiness is our current kind of discussion within the organization. And people are very particular in ARM or an engineering organization. They like things to be neat and tidy. And so we're saying, well, actually, it's not going to be, but it might be kind of 80% there. So let's work with that 80%. We'll worry about the 20% later or in the future. And I think that's been quite powerful actually for ARM, but actually as we talk to other organizations, and I imagine they're all recognizing the same kind of challenge and opportunity as well.
So mindset and a new approach is working really effectively. Are you incorporating any technology as well to help with this?
So it's a difficult one, to be honest, on technology. So it would be really easy to leap into some kind of either kind of massive spreadsheet of stuff, and we've been playing with this in our organization to try and resist our urge to suddenly create a huge kind of macro Excel thing that is SWP. It's like, well, that's not the thing. It's actually the mindset methodology. There might be some outputs, there might be some tracking we need to do. We also do have, and this is interesting again, thinking around, it's already happening in the organization. We have 3 or 4 different areas already looking at technology solutions within their context. So one part of the business looking at financial planning modeling, one part of the business looking at resource planning and how they can allocate resource and capabilities better to decide what their product teams are going to look like. So rather than say, hey, we're going to kind of take over on those things, we're just getting involved, having conversations and saying, let's understand how that might help us to map capabilities or skills in the organization. And let's see at the future if there is a technology solution. I'm not saying it's not right for some organizations. I just think I see many organizations jump in to say a shiny tool is the solution. Actually, for me, it's not. That you need to have the practices and the methodology in place and the kind of organizational mindset around workforce planning and being able to look into the future we just talked about. And yes, technology can help enable that, but I don't think it should be the starting point. So we've been quite cautious, saying we know we look at technology at some point, and when it comes up naturally, we'll look at it. But at the moment, we're not rushing in to say we want to deploy this tool because we think it's probably too early in our life cycle. Other organizations are probably at a different place, although I also suspect many would leap at technology as a solution rather than as an enabler.
So the Imagine Collaborative is such a diverse group of companies and people who have come together to really collaborate and come up with best practices. What are some of the outputs and useful tools that people could go to if they want more information about the collaborative SWP and learn more? What's available?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, really, that the group is really diverse. So you've got people from technology organizations like ARM, you've got people from the public sector there, you've got people from volume retail, and some organizations, we're an organization of around kind of 6,000 employees, about 8,000 people total. Some people are from 100,000 person organization, but actually the problems and challenges are very similar across sector and across organizations as well. So it's still really interesting hearing. Actually, I wouldn't have thought there'd be a link between how we are planning our teams and say a facility management organisation, which is in the group. But actually there is, right, because they have, and they might have different pressures, and for some organisations our problem of growth might be what we're focusing for. Some organisations might be saying, hey, we're facing a massive skills shift in our organisation, fintech for example, or financial services who are moving, saying we know that the march of AI and online is changing massively our skills base, so we need to take our people from A to B. So different ways that shows up. Ultimately, it's all about workforce planning challenges. So actually, one of the things we've done is we have already captured kind of the outputs of the past year, 18 months of the kind of first phase of work in a playbook, which has examples from the organisations who are taking part, sharing their kind of what they've done in their organisation. So it's kind of almost like crowdsourcing some of the ideas and things that are there. And it's not meant to be a kind of a rule book. It's a playbook, right? It's some things that you may find useful or less relevant or more relevant to your organisation. So the playbook, which is published online, you can go to, and it's free for everyone to take a look at and take some ideas away as well. And we've also got a LinkedIn forum, which we kind of shared recently, which allows people to just connect and say, hey, I'm really interested in the topic, love to learn more, or equally people are kind of starting to share some ideas and kind of questions on there as well. So a couple of ways to engage. And obviously we also then have the work on the SWP 2.0, which is kicking off as a new work stream for the collaborative team.
Brilliant.